So welcome to our second wave roundtable. I have sitting to my left 4 trailblazers, rabble-rousers, who probably need no introduction, but I'm going to give it a shot anyway. We have, to my immediate left, international award-winning filmmaker Jerry Rogers. Yeah, who, and I'm quoting, loves making films. Based on the feminist activism she learned from so many fabulous feminists in Newfoundland in the 1980s, and then at Studio D in Montreal, she went on to become the first out lesbian elected to the Newfoundland and Labrador House of Assembly in 2011. Ow! Yeah. And now after 8 years, she's back at making films and making lots of other trouble, we hear. Welcome, welcome. Next to Jerry, Noreen Golfman is happily retired, and I'm quoting, after almost 40 years at Memorial University, where she worked as, 40 years. Yes, as a professor and senior administrator. Memorial conferred an honorary doctorate on her this year. It was less painful than it sounds. Life in retirement has allowed her to become and to continue engaging with the arts community in various ways. While serving on the advisory board of the not-for-profit Studiosity, she's now a regular podcaster for them on higher education issues. Welcome, Noreen. Thanks for being here. To Noreen's left, Barbara Doran is with us. Welcome, Barb Doran. Yes. Woo! Yes. She has been writing, directing, and producing documentary and drama since 1984, with more than 30 films to her credit. Some of these include Random Passage and The Grand Seduction. You might have heard of them, maybe. Yeah. Barbara's life in film started at the Women's Studio and at the National Film Board, where she focused her work on violence against women, child sexual abuse, and women in developing countries. And she's bringing her expertise and experience here today. Thank you so much, Barbara Doran. Yeah. And last but certainly not least, social worker Peg Norman. It's here in your biography. What? Lies. I've been told lies. Not social worker Peg Norman. Who's a social worker? Sow yourselves. Peg, you did help to found and then manage Henry Morgenthaler's clinic in St. John's. This is true. This is true. As cinematographer, double checking here now, she filmed and appears in the award-winning film My Left Breast, which documents her partner Jerry Rogers' journey with breast cancer. Together, they own the Bee's Knees and the Travel Bug, 2 community-minded businesses on Water Street. Also true. I'm deeply sorry. I'm not making light. I'm sorry. This is what I have. Please welcome Peg Norman and our whole roundtable. So here's what's going to happen now. I'm going to sit over there and be quiet while these 4 illustrious folks are going to discuss a few questions that we circulated amongst ourselves. Questions such as, why did you join the feminist movement? What were your contributions to the movement, and what were the impacts? How did your life change because of the movement? What worries you and what excites you about where we are today and where we're going when it comes to women's and gender equality? Now, I don't expect any of these folks to color in the lines of these questions, and if they did, I'd be disappointed. So we're going to talk around through these questions for about 5, 7, 10 minutes each. And then we're going to open up the floor and have a good old gab about everything that comes up in that and beyond. Does that sound good to everybody? All right, away we go. Thanks. Okay, Barb, do you want to go first?
Yeah, not necessarily, but I will.
Okay. And you got to get you've got to get super close, intimate with this microphone because it likes to be yelled into.
Really close.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Thanks. Okay.
Good morning, everybody. So 5 minutes, will you, somebody pinch me or throw something at me? So, yeah, why did you join the women's movement? I was 24 years old. I was a single mother, recently divorced. I had no training except cutting up food into really small pieces, ironing my husband's shirts, folding laundry, not anything actually you could bring to the marketplace. Anyway, a friend of mine said there was a job at the university and that I should apply for it. So I did. And it was in the biochemistry lab. And I was applying for a job as a lab assistant. Excuse me. Well, the job turned out to be a rat killer. That was my job. Anyway, the benefit of that was I met Peter O'Brien. And Peter O'Brien told me about this group of women who had a consciousness raising group and that I should join. He said that my life was a mess, and the man was right. So I did. I went down. I was killing rats after all. I went down to the Women's Center. He took me by hand. And when I went in, there were a group of women, all of them were university profs. I was totally intimidated, but all of those women were so supportive of me, and I couldn't believe it. I had found a community of women that I never had before. And they plied me with books, the Betty Friedan's, the Gloria Steinem's, the Marilyn French. And it was like the top came right off my head. These were thoughts I never had before, that I didn't know existed. And it was a new world that opened up for me. And from there, I need water. From there, I went on to do women's studies. And I absolutely loved women's studies and hearing the other side of the story. Anyhow, I got a call from the National Film Board after I was part of the Women's Center. I was chair for a while. We opened up the transition house for battered women and the second stage housing program, because after we had battered women in our shelter for a while, they had to leave. 6 weeks, they had to leave. They had no place to go. So then we opened up the second stage housing project. And all of that behind me led me to the National Film Board, to Studio D, where Jerry Rogers was already installed. And I got a call and asked if I would go and research a series from you, research a series on battered women. And I had the academic creds at that point because of my women's studies minor, but also I had the firsthand experience of dealing with battered women and the situation that they were in with their children, with no hope, no hope. And so I left St. John's supposedly for 3 months. I stayed for 18 years. I did have a husband somewhere in between there who left. Anyway, my life has been, I wonder where I would be today if I had not walked into that room on Military Road and met all those incredible women who just took me by the hand and showed me there was another way other than the way I was. So there you go.
Thank you, Barb. And is this thing on? Yes. Thanks, Barb. Jerry, do you want to go pick up
Sure.
here, maybe?
Sure.
Yeah.
I was a breech birth, so I knew right from the start that there was more than one way of doing things. I don't know if my mother ever forgave me for that, but she let me pop out. Peg said to me just before we got here, she said, now, whatever you do, don't go on and on and on and on. I can't tell you how much I want to go on and on and on and on. There is so much to say and so many stories to tell. And not only did it take or does it take a village to do the work that we've all done, it also takes a village to try and remember it as well and to really jog each other's memories. I was the social worker, not Peg, and I did social work at Memorial, and one of my profs was Donna Dustin, and she was talking about how life was different for women. Nobody else in the faculty was talking about that. Nobody ever used the F word, the feminist. So she talked about that, and you know, the hair on the back of my neck would stand up in that class. And so I did, we had to do placements for our social work degree. And the first placement I did was at the Women's Center on Military Road. The fact that was on Military Road was so appropriate. And we were the first women's center that was owned by a women's collective in the country. We bought that house, and Barbara will be able to tell us a little bit about how that happened. I have bits and pieces of that. So Iris Kirby was working at the Secretary of State. And during those times, when we got funding for our women's centers, which were feminist activist centers, they were places of advocacy. They weren't simply places of service delivery like so many of our places are now. Iris Kirby was she was my supervisor. And the transition house now is called after Iris Kirby. Fabulous, fabulous woman activist. So the funding for the Women's Center came from the Secretary of State, most of it. And there was an expectation, but not only an expectation, an absolute obligation that we would lobby government, that we would push government, that we would be doing activism to change the world for women. It's not the case now. We saw through the Harper years that if we were doing activism with money, that we wouldn't get that money. And same with the CRA in terms of charitable status, that we can't be doing the kind of activism that we were doing. So this was at a time when there was no internet. We didn't have computers. We didn't even have word processors. We had pen and paper, and we had a typewriter. What's that? And we had a Gestetner, yeah. And so during that time, when I was doing the placement, Barbara was the coordinator at the Women's Center. And the board, I don't know, did we call it a board or did we call it a collective or a steering committee? I can't remember. Anyways, it was something. There was a group of us, and there were fabulous women. I'm going to be shouting out some of their names throughout our session here because I don't think we can say women's names enough and loud enough to acknowledge the work that we've all done together. So the placement, while I was at the Women's Center, Barbara was the coordinator, and there were no locked doors. The doors were open, and women would come in. And again, this was before the issues of intimate partner violence, rape, child sexual abuse. It wasn't out there in the public agenda. It wasn't on TV, it wasn't in the radio, it wasn't in the newspaper, not like today. But at the time, there was a lot of denial about those kinds of issues and what were happening to women. So we used to give workshops to the police about what we would call battered women at the time. The intimate family violence. And we would be giving workshops about sexual assault. And the police would be mandated to sit in a situation somewhat like this as we talked to them about these issues. And there was so much resentment and so much denial. We also, during that time that I was there initially, we were organizing a provincial women's conference. And again, the money that we raised to do those kinds of activities, there was an expectation that we would kick up shit, that we would be pushing, that we would be rabble-rousing. We had our CR groups. And one of the things I think during those times, those heady times, is that we had community. And we talked about our life experiences, which really informed the activism and the advocacy that we did. And we listened to each other in these CR groups. We talked about our lives. And we listened to each other with the real intention to be heard. Because often we weren't heard anywhere else, not in our workplaces, not in our families, not in social situations. And it was so powerful. And we built community. And we had such a strong sense of community and friendship that catapulted us, absolutely catapulted us into action and into activism. Some of the names that were on our board or our steering committee or whatever the heck we were, or our collective, were Jill Schooley, Billy Thurston, Wendy Williams, Kathy. What was Kathy's name? She lived on Waterford Bridge Road. Kathy, I don't know. Bonnie James, it'll come. We looked at issues when Barbara and I were working together during that time, a man in the closet, that single women with children who are on income support, if they had a boyfriend who would stay overnight, even temporarily, or even for a few nights a week, then inspectors from the welfare department would come and look through the closets to see if there was men's clothing there. And then they would be cut off. So we looked at those issues. Barbara was part of a group that designed and created a do-it-yourself divorce kit. So women would come to the Women's Center to get the do-it-yourself divorce kit. And Barbara was the queen of explaining how to do it and why you can do it and what kind of support you could get. We were listening to women come in and talk about being beaten at home. We were hearing from women talking about child sexual abuse. Again, those issues weren't out there on the public agenda. We were hearing about violations and unfairness and the UIC. Yeah, there was Barb Neese and Marilyn Porter, and we started working together, academia and those of us of the great unwashed in the streets. The Rape Crisis Center in that fabulous house on Military Road. We also housed the Rape Crisis Center, and Diane Duggan was kind of the leader and the keeper of the Rape Crisis Center. And there was a little office in the back room, and there was a telephone that was plugged into the wall, and we would all take turns answering that. And we did media, constantly trying to push the media to hear our stories and to hear about the issues that weren't out there and the services that weren't out there. There was also upstairs on the second floor of the Women's Health Education Network, a project that stemmed from the Women's Center. And then one of the big I graduated, no, after that placement, I ended up doing my second and final placement at the Health Sciences Center and developed a protocol for the identification and treatment of battered women, because battered women would come to the hospital often by taking overdoses, or if they had been physically assaulted, they often would say that they had bumped into a wall or bumped into a door or fallen down the stairs. And prior to the transition house, they had nowhere to go. So I did a protocol based on what was happening in Boston, where if a woman came in with unexplained injuries or who came in as an OD, that I would be contacted as a social worker, and I would go and speak with her and ask her how things were going and were things okay at home. And the first woman that I was referred to, I remember it was at night, and I walked in through the emergency, and there was a woman, a small, older woman. She had about 10 hairs on her head, and each hair was wrapped up in this pink sponge roller, and she had overdosed. And she had been given this solution to have her throw up the pills, a charcoal solution. So she had charcoal all around her mouth. And I went in and introduced myself and spent some time with her. Then I asked her, how are things at home? And she told the story of how she'd been beaten for years by her husband. And this was her way out. So I talked to her about the transition house, and our transition house, which was on Garrison Hill, next to the John Howard Society, go figure. We were about to open. We weren't quite ready to open. And everything was in place, and there was going to be a grand opening with media. And I said to her, I called our little board and I said, there's a woman here at the hospital. She has nowhere to go. Can we take her? Can we take her now, even though we're not fully open? And we decided to take her. And she ended up being a volunteer afterwards at the transition house. And she said, my God, how I love the women at the St. John's, at the Newfoundland Status of Women Council, because they brought me here to the transmission house. And it's true. She changed gears, and we all changed gears together. I'm going to stop here. There's so much more. I do want to go on and on and on, but I know that Peg and Noreen have such great stories, and we'll probably hit some more of those stories as we continue on.
Great. Thanks, Jerry. Noreen?
Yeah, so I do have a bit of time, do I? I've been thinking about what to say very much mindful of historicizing my experience and thinking about history and dates and my own emergence into this world, having been hired in 1984 by Memorial University into the English department, with my feminism pretty much not in full formation, in development. And I had come from United States, where I'd been working for a year, where there was an emerging conversation about women's studies and feminist criticism of literature, the influence of French writers and all of that. And I was in that swirl as an academic more than an activist at the time, just, pursuing my career. I used to say, I was in my Gidget gets a career phase of my life. And I can't say that the English department was the most welcoming place for somebody who had an itch to be an activist or engage in the community, but I was kind of oblivious in a way, a little bit like an Alice in Wonderland experience of coming here, not to mention the foreignness of the province and its, multi-hundred-year history of settlement and all of that, trying to get a handle on it. But how fortuitous, in a way, to have arrived in the 80s, in the mid 80s, when so much change was happening. And although you didn't put dates on what you were talking about, it's really the late 70s, 80s. Linda's talk certainly spoke to the 80s being dominant for, I guess, the emergence of solidarity of the community and a women's community around making change and transformation and putting structures in place and fighting government. All of that was emerging in a kind of swirl in an organic way, not necessarily in a, you know, what we would call now a very strategically defined, focused way. It was part of the swirl of what was changing here. So in 1988, as I'm sure everybody knows, and I certainly know Peggy knows, abortion law, the 1969 abortion law, was decriminalized. That was a huge, huge event in this country, to put it mildly, and I felt like I was there at that moment when that happened. In 1988, the same year, the inquiry into the allegations of sexual abuse at Mount Cashel was also launched. So you've got the, you know, parallel, let's say, initiatives, really landmark events happening in 1988. In 1989, I was approached by the local office of the NFB, to where we had an office when there were regional offices down on Water Street, to co-sponsor a film, a screening of Donna Reed's Burning Times. Some of you may have been in that room. Very, very popular, free screening at the LSPU Hall. 1989 became, because of the success of that screening, the official first year of what became the Women's International Film Festival, which I helmed for 30 years. And again, this is 88, 89, lots happening in the environment here. Not randomly, certainly, but it's not as if, as somebody, you know, working through the Gidget gets a career ladder. I was really conscious of these influences on my thinking and the path that I was going to take. In that year, in late 88, CBC Radio approached me to do social commentary on the morning show, which I did for a number of years before they elevated me to television. And one of the first commentaries I did was on being pro-choice, being a pro-choice advocate. And I got a call from a woman I will not name, who many of you know, somebody I admired very much. Let's call her old school second wave St. John's. And she's not alive, but she did have a big influence on many of us. And she called me up after the commentary and said, are you out of your mind going public with that commentary, with your pro-choice platform? And I was actually really shocked, both naive and shocked, and said, what are you talking about? She said, that's just not going to happen here. There's not going to be a clinic here. There's not going to be, this government, this culture is dead set against anything having to do with choice. This is a pro-life culture, and you're going to be tarred, you'll be branded, you'll be ostracized. I didn't tell her to shag off, but I really had the chutzpah of being young enough and firm enough in my belief, having come from the mainland and just having realized the enormous effect of decriminalization of the abortion law, that I didn't really have to worry very much or pay attention to her. So I got the attention through that commentary on CBC of what was then the Canadian Abortion Rights Action League, national organization, lobbying very hard for decriminalization in the first place, working with Henry Morgentaler on setting up clinics across the country. Quebec, of course, being the sort of headquarters of his activity. And I ended up becoming very quickly, as the only Newfoundlander who had been part of Chorale at all, vice president of the organization. And working with that wonderful office on Military Road that was around the corner from my house, getting to know those women and asking to join up with it was indeed a board. And we renamed it a mother board, actually, which is why I remember it was a board, at least at the time when I intersected with them. And I remember being very, very welcomed by them. And indeed, ultimately, when Henry Morgenthaler called me up in 1988 to say, will you come work for me stealthily, undercover, you cannot tell a soul, the only person who knew about the purchase of a property on the Marchant Road that was to become the abortion clinic was Wendy Williams, whose name has come up a number of times, who was on city council. And she knew the purpose of Henry having secured that clinic. Nobody ever asked what the clinic was going to be for. So it kind of slid under the radar. But I should add that Eleanor Gill Radcliffe was the initial purchaser of that property. Very little known piece of history. So when you put all of these things together and foreground the kind of right before our eyes collapse of the moral patriarchal authority of the Roman Catholic Church because of the launch of that inquiry, you had an open space for that clinic to exist, despite the fact that on opening day, November 14th of 1989, it was a violent experience, as you folks know, and I was right behind Henry, who had been pushed down to the ground, and we were surrounded by about 150, mostly male, raging men who had been either parachuted in from Glace Bay, Nova Scotia, or had been somehow recruited by the church to intimidate us. Henry, a survivor of the Holocaust, was not going to be intimidated by 100 men who were demented in that moment. We were heavily protected by both the RCMP and the RNC, for whom I will forever be grateful, and Peg knows those guys who were undercover helping us through that whole operation. But I have often reflected afterwards about the kind of confluence of events in the late 80s that made the space possible, the emergence of a women's studies program possible, all of these things happening, again, not with necessarily any wide collective plan, but a series of pockets of activist initiatives, the shelters, the Women's Center, and that Women's Center was absolutely key for protecting the woman who would both that day enter the clinic to have their procedures and in the following months. And I always thought about that woman who had called me to say, you're out of your mind for doing this. She even followed up one time, and it's an interesting sort of anecdote about the tensions in the community itself, perhaps generational, whatever it might be, when she said, you should not be hanging around with those women. They're a bunch of rabid lesbians. And those rabid lesbians made that clinic safe. And Tree Walsh and that whole group, for whom I am deeply, deeply grateful, because they protected us and had the guts that inspired people like me and others with whom we worked, the nurses who came aboard, eventually Peggy, who will talk more about that, I'm sure, who took inspiration from their strength and that solidarity. So it's maybe a little more than 7 minutes, but I really wanted to put together those dates and those events that were happening here, about which I'm not sure anybody has written in a kind of historical, with that perspective. And I'd be happy to contribute to a piece or a reflection on the 80s in this province, and particularly in this town, that probably needs some scholarly attention. There's a lot of grist there for somebody's mill. Over to you, Peg.
Thank you. Thank you, Noreen. Scholars in the room, take note. Take note. All right. Thank you so much. Peg, over to you. Yeah.
I'm feeling a little bit intimidated sitting here with the three of them talking about their long history in the women's movement in St. John's. I arrived here grew up in Gambo, but like every good Newfoundlander, went to Ontario, went to Alberta first and then to Ontario, and eventually settled back here in I would say 86. It was around 86. Came back with a 6-year-old, and one of the first things my brother said to me when we were having dinner at the ship one night was, or not dinner, we were having a beer at the ship, was, "You have to go to the Women's Center and meet Beth Lacey." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because she's a lesbian. And it's a women's organization, and I think you would fit in there." And so I'm eternally grateful to my brother, Derek Keats, for having done that way back then. He had been living here in St. John's and had done his undergrad, grad, and PhD here at MUN. So I came back here having come out in Toronto, and where being a baby dyke and feminist was really hard to find your place because you were siloed really quickly in a large center, large city like that. So I remember coming back here and having the experience of being, the ship has played a major role in my life for many, many, many years. And in fact, I had supper there last night. But being at the ship, having beers with a bunch of people after some event, a protest of some sort, and I look around the table and I'm surrounded by people like me, but also straight white men, profs from the university, women living on welfare. And it very quickly became clear that I could find my place here in this city, and that I did have a voice, and there were people like me and people who didn't look like me or have the same experiences that I could be allied with. And so that was a really important event for me. And finding the Women's Center was pivotal in my life. And I remember the first time I met Noreen, I think you were already doing the radio and the TV stuff. And I remember it was a TGIF, which was really important for the community. It was every third Friday or something like that. And it would start at 5 o'clock, and we would go to the Fountain Spray to keep buying beer, because we would drink the beer and somebody would take the cash and go to the Fountain Spray to buy more beer. And but I remember you coming in and going, "Oh my God, I saw her on TV." But so I grew up in the Women's Center. I eventually lived upstairs on the second floor in the apartment, and Ian went to Bishop Field, and I was a part of the Rape Crisis Center, and Diane Duggan and Mary Doyle, and they were all such huge influences in my world. I never did a social work degree. I did some courses here at MUN, and because I was a student, registered student, I also got the opportunity to do, for a short period of time with CHMR, I did a program once a month on women in music. And so I would come in and take over a studio and play Holly Near and Farron, and I would bring in women from the local music community. There was a woman, I don't remember her name, I hope somebody does. She lived on Bell Island, and she was an accordion player. And I discovered her, I think, through Wanda Crocker, who was also a lifelong friend and a traditional music player, had introduced me to her. So I had fingers in university, but my roots were in community as an activist. And my involvement with the clinic came from being the person that if you wanted something done, you called me regardless of what it was. If I had never done it before, I would always say, "Sure, I'll try." And so I got called from somebody at the Women's Center. No, it wasn't Peggy Meisner. It was somebody at the Women's Center first. It might have been Tree Walsh, who said, "You need to come in, we have to tell you something." And I came in and I was told the secret. And it was like, "Are you fucking kidding me?" All right. And so I ended up being at the clinic putting together furniture. That was my first job. I assembled all of the exam tables and the chairs that were in the recovery room, and I put together the ultrasound machine, and I got the autoclave set up, and I did all of that. And I was there when you and Henry were trying to come through the mob. We were inside looking out. And I tell you, it was frightening. And Alphonsus Penny I think he was actually in that crowd that day. The vitriol, the hate, yeah, he was, if nobody knows that name, he was the Archbishop and had a huge hand in the cover-up and the continuation of abuse of boys at Mount Cashel. Funny side story about Mount Cashel was that I grew up in Gambo, and I was in junior high when I, for several years in a row, would hold a raffle to raise money selling tickets on a turkey to send to Mount Cashel. Yeah, and that because I thought it was so unfair that these kids were being forced to live in an orphanage in my lifetime. And so here I am standing inside the Morgentaler Clinic looking out at Penny, yelling and screaming and spitting at Henry and you coming through the door. But yeah, so I grew up in the women's movement in St. John's, and had that good fortune of spending then the next 10 years or more at the clinic, and eventually was manager, and also made it a mission to make sure that, because when we started, women would have to pay out of pocket for an abortion. And the only place that women could get an abortion without having to pay out of pocket for the procedure was across the street here at the Health Science Center. And it was during a time when they would have to, convince a doctor in their community that they could not continue with the pregnancy, which was no mean feat in and of itself. Finding a doctor and then finding one that would give them a referral. And then they had to get into St. John's to meet with the abortion board. There was a group of people who had the say-so whether or not this woman was then going to be allowed to actually go and see the pre-op nurse and get to the next stage. So given that abortion is safest, surgical abortion is safest performed between 6 and 12 weeks. Most women don't know they're pregnant until they're 6 to 8 weeks. So when you think about how many women were turned away because they just never got there in time, and the ones that were lucky enough to get there in time then had to sit before a panel of complete strangers who stood judgment over them and got to decide their fate for the rest of their fucking lives. And then if they were lucky enough to get through that stage, and then they actually got an OR time, they would have to go for their preoperative one day and meet with a counselor who had to confirm that they weren't crazy, but in order to get the abortion, they had to tell them that they were crazy. It was all insanity. So they would have the procedure performed by a physician who hated women. But he did it because, I'm not sure. I still don't know. Maybe you have insight into that. Yeah, but so it was pretty arduous. So then when we set up, we charged women money, and it was that because we had to. There was no way to fund the clinic. So I made it my mission while I was there to lobby government with the help of many, many, many other feminists in this community, and we eventually were successful in getting the provincial government to extend funding to anybody who had an MCP card. And so I guess that would be the thing that I'm most proud of that I have done in the feminist community in this province. Thanks. Yeah, and then but the Women's Center was a lot of fun, and there's lots of great stories. Secretary of State takeover, getting faxes from the emergency room staff at St. Clair's and support, the Boy Scouts in Marystown. I mean, it was pretty heady. The occupation of Secretary of State, it was when they withdrew they were going to withdraw core funding from women's centers across the country. And without core funding, it would have reduced us to doing what is happening now, where any projects that happen that are beneficial to marginalized groups is all based on direct services. And what we were doing was not. We were activists. We were helping to change policy. We were helping to change hearts and minds. And so we moved in. We moved into Secretary of State for, I think, about a week. And lots of people got arrested, and it was crazy, and but it was successful at the same time. Yeah, it was a national movement for sure.
Can I just ask the first question? Is there a film about this, and where do we get it?
I don't think there's a film, but I think I shot a lot of it, and I think I got the camera from Mun Extension, and that was also why I didn't get arrested, because when the RNC came, they thought I was media. But I think I gave all of that footage to the archives here at Mun. I think I don't have it anymore, but yeah, I think I gave it. Yeah, I think it's here somewhere. And yeah, there's a lot of there was a lot of media coverage around that event, and there was a lot of then we had the Wiener Roast. The Wiener Roast. Who remembers the Wiener Roast? Jerry Wiener was the Minister, Secretary of State. And when we were kicked out, eventually arrested and oisted out of the offices, we started, well, what's our next move? We need to keep on pushing. And so we organized a Wiener Roast across the park across the road in Bannerman Park. We had, yeah, it was a lot of fun.
I think what's kind of interesting there too is that all that activism really had an impact across the country, that then they didn't take away core funding. And there was another issue that came out of the Women's Center as well, is the Constitution. When there was the possibility of having a notwithstanding clause applied against our equality cause, Clause 28, and we staged a huge protest through the Women's Center. Brian Peckford was our premier at the time, and he was very wishy-washy. He was going to allow that to happen, have the notwithstanding clause. It was him, and then it was also Blakeney and Regina. So as the women's, we had a huge protest at Confederation Building. And then I was sent to Regina to lobby Blakeney with women activists from all over the country. And then we went to Ottawa and continued and our activism and our lobbying, and we won. But we were part of making that happen. From our Women's Center at Military Road, the impact again was national and historic. There's a book written about that, but nothing about our involvement from Newfoundland and Labrador is included in that history because nobody came to speak to us.
We have so many things to talk about and ask questions about. I have a microphone. Darcy has a microphone. If you have a question, please raise your hand and one of us will come to you with a microphone about any of this and more.
Well, first of all, thank you to all of you for the bravery that you showed and the commitment. In many ways, we're facing the same situation, a backlash. And coming back to the province, it's actually interesting to hear your experiences and draw parallels with mine south of the border. There's so many the same. But it seems to me there was a whole generation of women who were prepared to use their positions and to press. And something has happened in the interim. You all took chances. And that's why you pushed so far ahead. And what's happened, I mean, it's partly a broader cultural question, but also I think what's happened to the women's movement, both sides of the border, is so many organizations have become reliant on government funds, and you're put in a horrible position then. Do you sacrifice the mission, risk the mission, or do you go public? The other thing that I think was so unique about the 80s, well, it would have been the 70s in the States, is the sense of community. And I was so struck at the loss of that, being involved with the Gosling statue that morning when it was unveiled. A number of young women came up to me and said, we've never been in this sort of environment before. So given the threats we're facing, Is there any way to reconstitute that sense of community? The other thing I noticed coming back to St. John's is everybody's working in silos. You know, maybe it was a moment in history. God knows as a historian, I should know this. You can't repeat history. But can that sense of community and commitment be revived? Because it's so obvious we are facing such a threat again.
It's such a big question, Margot, because, you know, the sense of helplessness that, as you said, it's kind of broader cultural issue now or challenge that people feel like it's overwhelming when you see where the pendulum has swung. And you wonder how you can marshal that kind of collective activity around one thing or two things, since it's all so maybe deliberately complex and ideological. I mean, it's an absolutely key question. I don't have an answer for it. You know, will it take some, you know, near apocalyptic, horrible event to galvanize people? There are pockets of it happening, certainly in the US right now, but the resistance is almost frustratingly slow and lumbering, and with the media being compromised, it's difficult to see how that space I talked about opening up, where people could start filling in, putting themselves in that space. It's hard to imagine right now, as dark as that observation is. Maybe others feel more optimistic. People do say to me sometimes, and somebody said this last night after your talk at the reception, somebody came over to me and said, but young people, they're so great. You know, that kind of statement. Yeah, what are they doing? What do they care about? I don't know. But that was sort of a statement of some bland optimism. I don't know. Maybe it was a he. Maybe he was right. But I don't see it.
I feel there is such joy in activism and such empowerment in activism. And I miss some of those heady days when we would sit in the Women's Center and talk about our lives and spark and ignite each other. And I think it's still possible, but some of us do it by having dinner parties or TGIFs or you know, that the reaching out to one another to get together, I think, is one of our most powerful tools. Radical hospitality, I think right now, is one of our most powerful tools to get together, to hear each other and to, again, ignite each other and to conspire, you know, to breathe together, to conspire. For me, that's my lifeline. Without it, life is too hard. And in our cultural spaces, and we need to take them over. We need to get together and not, if we don't have money to have wine and cheese, what odds? You know, bring your own biscuits and your own beer or your own cup of tea. We have to get together. We have to. We have to.
I really feel for young women today, because there is no sense of community. That's what we had, and that's where the strength came from. And we'd have minor successes, like in 1972, women in Newfoundland were not permitted to sit on juries because, of course, we're so emotional. And we were emotional. But so you had a little success like that. And then that gave you strength. And there was hope that we could make a change. And I think that's part of what's happening with young women today, women in general, and to extend that to people. We're feeling incapacitated. to do anything about the social situation, the political situation that we're facing. And we can go backwards. Recently, there was a warehouse full of contraceptives burnt in the United States. Abortion laws are being repealed, and so on and so forth. And I don't know where the women are going to find that community. And we were fortunate to have it, and to have the courage to take it all on, church, state, whatever.
Thank you. Thank you so much for such an amazing panel. You made me cry, the whole lot of you. I just want to talk about this idea about youth. I think I was born in 1964, and I think that was the golden year to be born. I grew up with a social safety net. As soon as I hit 16, I was working in a park teaching puppetry. So, you know, my kids, there were no jobs teaching puppetry in a park. These young people today are growing up after the housing crisis. They'll never own a house. They are growing up with all of our social safety net being poured into the military. They are living in a moment when the university is crumbling, all universities all over the globe, which was a safe haven for thought and community. I don't think we can kind of lay it on the young people that they are not rising up. Like, it's pretty freaking hard to rise up when you are working in a gig economy with 3 or 4 jobs. And, you know, sometimes going in for 2 hours and leaving. And yet they are protesting all kinds of things and shutting down the universities. So I think, in fact, they, you know, require a little bit of respect, given that people my age are the ones having profited that have dumped this world on them.
I 100%. I think that's what we're trying to say.
No, I know, but I'm
Yeah,
just saying, like, there's,
it's a bigger fight in a way right now. You know, we had targets we could identify and rally around. The target now is huge and moving in the wrong direction.
I think that I look back at, you know, the heyday of my activism, and we didn't have cell phones, and we didn't have internet, and we had a telephone and a photocopier and phone trees. And you know, I remember, you know, showing up at demonstrations not because I got an email 2 weeks ago or a Facebook invitation that I may or may not have seen, but because somebody called me or somebody knocked on my door and said, we're doing this, or Nelson Mandela and Winnie Mandela are flying into Torbay to refuel on their way to Ottawa, and we ended up there. You know, like 150 of us had that privilege. But that was all through, you know, we were connected and we had community. And I think, you know, we still have, you know, lots of connections, and we have a great community. And, you know, Jerry's reference to radical hospitality, I mean, that's what we practice. We try to practice on a regular. But I think I have so little connections now. I'm 61. I also was born in 64, with young people. I mean, I don't know. People say, oh, young people aren't on Facebook. Oh, how come? Because it's a great resource. I know what everybody is doing and what their dogs look like, and, you know, what vacation they just went on or what they had for dessert. But I think, you know, so I don't know young people, but I try, and I look around this room and there's very few young people. But I have to, in order to get up in the morning and haul on a pair of socks, trust that young people are doing shit and they understand what's going on and how their futures are so desperately being threatened. And that I hope that they, they understand, and I trust that they do understand that they're being, there's a concerted effort to get them to stick their face in their phones and leave it there and see nothing but memes and cat videos. And I live in hope, because otherwise I don't know. And we all did. I mean, we're all, you know what it's like generationally. I remember being, 16, 17 years old and looking at older people in my community, and those older people were 20 years younger than I am now, right? I mean, it's all relative. And, not being able to see the work that they had done to get me where I was. And it's only in hindsight that I can look back and, listening to Linda talk about, history of women's work and, all of that stuff in Newfoundland and how it got us where we are today. That I'm able to go, yeah, you know what, young people are the same as I was when I was young, naive, and you just see what's in front of you and you just keep going forward. And so I live in hope, and I trust that our young people are smart and resilient, and they are going to change the world.
A few years ago, when we had Come Home Year, there was money to do events, and Peg and I live primarily out around the Bay, and I thought, who's not going to come back home? Who has not felt like Newfoundland has been, and Labrador has been, a safe home? And so I kind of started shuffling my feet and making noise and thinking, let's do a different kind of Come Home Year event and celebrate the lives of gays and lesbians and trans folks who had to leave because it was too hard here, or who and haven't come home, or also that community, people from that community all over the province as well. So we organized in our small community, Small Point, Broad Cove, Blackhead, Adams Cove, the smallest town with the longest name and the biggest heart. We organized Come Home Queer. And there were a lot of young people. And they talked about, and it was it was about storytelling. It was about telling your stories about what home means to you. And we were listening to each other and hearing each other's stories. And so many young folks talked about never having had that opportunity to come together in a safe place, to be who they are, and to celebrate with also some of us older people. And I think we need to be able to continue to make those kinds of safe, inclusive spaces where we can hear each other, where we can tell each other our stories, and where we can conspire and organize. I think it's so incredibly important.
Thanks, everyone. I just want to echo what Lisa said. I see young people in my classrooms all the time who are super excited and super engaged and are doing really great work in their communities. They're protesting in the streets about things from as diverse as climate change to the genocide in Gaza to, to the destruction of Memorial University, right? Like, students are out protesting tuition hikes. And they are working 4 or 5 jobs, and they're exhausted, but they're finding community. I like to think that more of them would be here if they weren't working on a Saturday morning at Starbucks or wherever they're working. But for sure, and I think that you're right though, Peg, that sometimes we don't see what's directly behind us because we're so focused on moving forward. But that's why we're here this morning, isn't it? And I'm really glad that, we're having this conversation, because it can be one of the tricky parts is that intergenerational connection, I think, right? That we need to maintain, that respect and communication, right? That we all should have for one another, which is super exciting. So yeah, so we like to think that in gender studies, but not just in gender studies, right? That we're doing work that is inspiring young people, and we see them protesting, we see them doing really important work, making art, like this, which was not AI generated, which was an amazing student of ours who did this, right? So yeah, I have hope, and I see them doing really cool stuff. So I'm glad about that. Just a plug for them. Thank you, guys. Questions or comments, because we have a few minutes before we go to lunch, or we can call it, or would you like to say anything else from our wonderful panel?
There is a lot of activism among young people. That is my observation. I mean, and look at the tent encampments. Look at the 3 women who went on the flotilla. I mean, it may not be around the same issues, but it's activism, and making the connections is imperative. And Margot organized a wonderful, I had my activist and academic career in the States as well. Margot organized a wonderful panel for women's history. I think, was I heading the program then? I don't know. Called Across the Generations. And it was a panel like this of people speaking to each other about activism. And well, you should explain it better, Margot, but
Yeah, and then the point was to talk to younger people who are just, beginning their careers, as it were, in activism. It was a very productive panel, and I think people were, from both sides of the generational divide, ended up very inspired by each other. Yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to say, because Peg mentioned Holly Near, is that music was such an integral part of our activism. I remember taking my Arabic drum to some of the conferences and doing Fight Back, that song. Some of you won't know it, but it's just, yeah, it was really good. And I think that, there is that continuation. So
I just have one small little anecdote
Right.
that I'm going to tell, because it came up earlier about the 52% solution. And I made the pilgrimage to the Michigan Women's Music Festival in 80, I don't know, 88. I have no idea. It was sometime in the 80s. And me and Tree Walsh were traveling together. We fly to Toronto, and we take a Greyhound bus through Detroit and then onto the festival, which was, and so I'm setting my tent up. I'm setting up the tent that Tree and I are sleeping in. Tree Walsh is sitting on a stump smoking a draw, and I turn around and was like, how did you get that here? So she crossed the border. I almost killed her with weed. But I turned around, and just up the hill from me, there's a couple of women, and one of them turns around, and she's wearing a T-shirt that has the 52% solution on it. And I go, how many 52% solution organizations could there possibly be that have T-shirts that look exactly alike? It was Margot Dooley. That was pretty funny. It made my world of feminism and activism. It was a full circle moment, and yeah. But music was a very important part of my. We brought Holly Near here for a concert at Holy Heart years ago. We brought Heather Bishop in. Music was such an important part of our activism. What's that saying? If I can't dance, I don't want to be part of the revolution. And we did women's dances. Kate Bess used to play music at the Grad House. I mean, the peace accord was a huge part of that activism that was going on, and that was a bunch of young people that grew out of Oxfam, and there was a lot of stuff going on. But music was so important to my experience of the women's movement, and it's the soundtrack of my life when I look back at it. Farron, I just Sandy Pottle and Beth Decker and Beth Lacey, and it was all, and the lesbians we were all baby dykes, and I wouldn't say we were welcomed with open arms into the Women's Center. We invaded the Women's Center. And they had no other choice but to take us in. And there was some pushback, but it became a very safe place to be, a safe haven. So the Women's Center was not just the seed of activism around around rape and the prevention of sexual assault and rape, and the issue of choice and abortion access. But it was also a seat of comfort and caring and activism for queer rights, and that was a huge part, and the whole change in the Human Rights Code in Newfoundland grew out of the activism that we did at the Women's Center. So the Women's Center played huge, and I was so sad when they sold it, and it was devastating. Anyway, but it was a huge part of our history, and it would be, if anybody is looking for a great research project, I tell you, it's deep and it's fun, and it was doing the work of thousands, and it was on the backs of, if we were lucky, 50. But it was a lot of fun.
And it was out of a screening of Not a Love Story that we organized at the Women's Center. And Kathleen Shannon, who was the executive director of Studio D, came and hung out for 4 days. I ended up hanging out with her and, kind of hosting her around. And then she made me an offer I couldn't refuse or understand. And I ended up going to Studio D to work because I said to her, there were no women making films in Newfoundland at the time. And I said, we don't need films about us. We need to be able to tell our own stories. So I ended up in Montreal, again with an offer which made no sense, because what did I know about making films? And then we were going to make a series of films on intimate family violence, battered women. And so I thought, well, the filmmakers at Studio D, they haven't done any work in that area. So I called Barbara and I said, Barbara, come and be a researcher on that project. Will you come and do that? And then the next thing you know, we had Annette Clark working with us. And so the number of women from Newfoundland doing a lot in film started from the seeds of that screening and that activism at our Women's Center. So there's so much history that we haven't even touched on today that it can go on and on and on and on. But yeah, and we're just so incredibly lucky because what started in that Women's Center lives on in some of the work that we do, and then the work that so many of the young women and gender activists are doing now too.
All right, we do have one quick last one from our okay.
Yeah, so we only have a couple of minutes, but I do want to ask if there is somebody or something from your experiences that stuck with you that you found especially inspiring, a person, an event, anything.
One of the names that has come up here several times today has been Wendy Williams. And Wendy has been a friend since the day that I met her. When I started at the clinic, she was at the Advisory Council on Status Women, but she had also been one of the founding members of Planned Parenthood. So had been at the forefront of the issues around reproductive choice in this province, had come at it with a nursing background, and then went on to serve on council. I remember there was a municipal election that was happening around the same time that the clinic was being publicly announced, and there was some significant pushback from a candidate that thought that they were a shoo-in and ended up being fearful that this was going to impact their chances of winning. But Wendy was always, and always has been, and to this day, we saw her most recently this past summer, I think, one of the strongest, clear-thinking, articulate people that I've ever known, ever met, around the issues of feminism. And when I worked at the clinic, she was also there. I remember she came in and acted as counselor for a period of time. So Wendy will always be that icon in my world.
I'll just follow up with a Wendy story that changed everything for me. After 10 years of the clinic, you remember we had an anniversary celebration. Henry came down. It was wild. It was wild. I remember at some point, I could be misremembering, but I do have a recollection of Gene Smith throwing buns at me across the table. You know, it was raucous and celebratory. I was sitting across from Wendy at dinner. That was the 10th year of the Women's Film Festival, and I was struggling to get money to put it on. I was still in Gidget Gets a Career mode, trying to figure out how to juggle all of this. And I just confessed to Wendy, I said, I can't go on. I just can't do it. I can't carry the festival forward. 10 years, I think I'm going to call it a day. And she just tore a strip off me. And she said, look around this room. You absolutely have to keep going. And it was like, you know, unequivocal lecture of, yeah, guilted me, right? And okay, I just kept going. And it was Wendy. I don't know if she even knows that story, but I remember what she was wearing when she said that, you know?
I have a Wendy Williams story. It was when, during the Constitution crisis, and we knew we had to, the women of Newfoundland and Labrador had to be in the middle of that battle. And so we were at the Women's Center, we were conspiring and inspiring. And they said, okay, Jerry, you're going to go to Regina and lobby Blakeney and then Ottawa. And Wendy and Bonnie James both pulled out their checkbooks. And how many times have I seen those women pull out their checkbooks? But we can't enough mention, there's Lisa Moore teaching our people to tell their stories, their powerful fucking stories. There's Sonia Boone, who needs to come back, who is helping people write their stories and tell their stories. Linda, I was away in Montreal for 10 years. I missed when you were doing all that great, fabulous stuff. Jennifer James, when I decided to run for a political office, she was at a lunch that I had with 13 women. It happened to be 13. It was a coven. And Jennifer said, I didn't really know Jennifer. She said, I could help. I could help make that happen. And then Barbara Doran, who was my first, she doesn't know this, my first real mentor, her and Iris Kirby. And then the gifts that Noreen Golfman gives to our community through the women's studies, through her teaching, through the Film Development Corporation, through the MUN Cinema, through the Women's Film Festival. We are so fucking lucky, and we really have to keep telling each other what a great job you're doing. What a great job. What a great job.
Love it.
And to find the joy as we conspire together and inspire each other. We have to. We just have to.
Yes, I think that's a great place to end it. Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate this. And thank you all for being here.